I'm delighted you could all join us this evening. My name is Ewan Watt. I'm with the Charles Koch Institute. Again, thanks for joining us. There's more than 1,000 alumni of our school's educational programs can tell you the Charles Koch Institute welcomes debate, scholarship, and analysis of crucial public policy issues. Our guest this evening has built a reputation for being at the forefront of the debate in the media and on Capitol Hill, whether it pertains to economic freedom, immigration reform, or the personnel practices of the Pentagon. In his 2012 book, Bleeding Talent, he called on the military to take inspiration from F.A. Hayek, Milton Friedman, and Adam Smith, and overhaul how it uses incentives to retain its best and brightest. The New York Times and National Review were but two media outlets that lauded the book's policy recommendations. Earlier this year, with economist Glenn Hubbard, he released Balance, which closely examined how few of the world's great civilizations have fallen to outside invaders, but collapsed as a result of rent-seeking, trade protection, currency debasement, economic imbalances, and crumbling political institutions. The book not only highlighted the challenges ahead for America, but also identified some possible policy solutions to halt our nation's slide. As part of the Charles Koch Institute's work to foster productive dialogue amongst diverse voices on critical topics, we are pleased to welcome an Air Force veteran, an award-winning entrepreneur, and the chief economist of the Hudson Institute, Dr. Tim Kane.
All right. This is my water, Ewan, not yours? I can't take this as seriously, especially when you have that foreign accent. I feel like I should be very formal and try to do my best. I thought I was supposed to tell a lot of economist jokes, and that was it, and then we could go right to Q&A, but I'll limit it to one Adam Smith joke. All right, I'm going to turn this on. But thank you for having me here, Ewan, and thanks to the Koch Institute. There's a real danger when you have an economist tell a joke. It's not really our forte, but you've got to do that to start a speech like this, and it's somewhat relevant. Because we've been critiqued. Our book, Balance, has been reviewed about everywhere you could hope for. Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The Economist. And they're all different. But when you're an economist writing about history, you can imagine the sort of feedback you're going to get. So with that, Adam Smith is walking home, and he realizes he's forgot to plan his dinner. And he runs across a shepherd who's got this humongous flock of, I think you call them a flock of sheep. And he says, okay, I've got an idea. I'll challenge this guy. So he says to the shepherd, and Ewan, I'm not going to try to do a Scottish accent. He says, sir, I'll wager you a gold coin that I can guess how many sheep you have. And if I win, I get one of the sheep I'll take home for dinner. And the shepherd says, sure, there's no way he'll guess 1,017. And he says, I'll take that wager. And so Adam Smith goes, 1,017. And the shepherd is shocked. He says, all right, you guessed the right number, sir. Go ahead. Adam Smith reaches down, grabs an animal. He's walking down the road. And the shepherd says, but wait, let me try double or nothing. I bet I can guess your profession. And Smith says, all right, go ahead. I'll take it. And he says, you're an economist. And Adam Smith's turn to be surprised. He says, how did you know? And the shepherd says, well, put my dog down and I'll let you know. So look, the knock is that we're good at counting things, but maybe not what those things are. Now, as Ewan said, I do have a background not just in economics. I spent some time overseas stationed in Korea and Japan with the U.S. military, was an undergraduate at the U.S. Air Force Academy. So I've seen the world through those eyes, and in particular, being stationed in Korea before it was a first world country and understanding what economic really means for solving prosperity where there is real poverty, where there is a real lack of development. And I've gone back to Korea since, and the transformation is really fabulous. The contrast between South and North Korea says something good about America and great about Korea, and that alliance. When people ask Glenn and I, how long did it take to write the book, there are two answers. One is it took 6 months, because that's what Simon & Schuster said. They wanted the book in 6 months. They were afraid that Romney would win and we would disappear and never finish the manuscript because Glenn was an advisor to Mitt Romney. But in the other sense, it's been written for 20 years. In fact, when I first reached out to Glenn, he had a manuscript on economic history that he thought he would never get to. And he asked if we might merge the two ideas. So I was tickled to work with him. It's been an honor. And some of these chapters, literally, I've had written, the Japan chapter, for example. Other chapters haven't. I didn't know much about Ottoman history at all. But what we did is we took this idea of countries becoming economically imbalanced and looked to see if the patterns were the same, and they were. So we'd already talked at length about Roman history. Most Americans have done that. We've talked about Japanese recent history and its economic development. What we see again and again is a pattern of economic imbalance. And this picture is the picture from the Congressional Budget Office of the sort of imbalance that's created what we think is the existential crisis facing America. And we make a bit of a controversial point that may rub some conservatives the wrong way, that the existential crisis facing America, it's not terrorism, it's not barbarians at the gates, it's not the Goths and the Visigoths across the rivers of Europe that faced Rome, it's our own internal stagnation. America's existential threat is America and the choices and decisions we make. It's not China, it's not Japan. So what's scary about these two scenarios the CBO puts out, they have a baseline scenario where it looks like debt to GDP is rising, but they have an alternative fiscal scenario, which you might think of as the realistic scenario, where a lot of the patchwork doesn't get patched, that they always promise to do next year, kick the can down the road. The law says they'll start tightening on fraud or on doctors' repayment rates in Medicare, but they don't. They loosen them up year after year. What's really terrifying when you dig into these CBO long-term reports is the alternative fiscal scenario assumes that almost immediately, within 6 to 12 months, we'll return as a nation to full employment, right? That high unemployment rate will go away. We'll return to a full labor force participation rate. We'll return to fast economic growth rates. How many times do we have to hear that promise year after year after year, the recovery of summer, or the summer of recovery, and have it not happen? So, maybe we can't count sheep, but we can read government reports. And this should be alarming to anyone, Republican or Democrat. And the amazing thing is there is a great consensus among Republicans, Democrats, and this strange species called independents. Sometimes in this town, though, it feels like it's not Republicans versus Democrats, it's economists versus politicians. And so I'm going to talk what I hope is on behalf of a consensus of economists tonight and the patterns that we've seen in history. All right, there's a clicker up here. Let's see if this works. All right, so what is power? One of the things we wanted to do with this book is to add to the legacy of economists defining the world in a way that politicians debate and often get things wrong. It traces back to Adam Smith, who talked about factors of production being land, labor, and capital. But exactly a century before The Wealth of Nations in 1776, another Englishman, William Petty, wrote a book called, I think it was The Arithmetic of Power or something. I'm sorry, it's in the footnotes. Petty was really fascinated with poverty in Ireland and wanted to understand why Ireland was poorer than England. But he also wanted to challenge the notion at the time that France was the great rival of England. And he pointed out, look at the Netherlands. They export 10 times as much as France with 1/10 the population. So he introduced at a very rough stage ideas of productivity. But never before had people tried to quantify things. And Petty was saying you need to use arithmetic, measure, not just rhetorical arguments. Well, that got updated with this idea of GDP that you've all heard of. What you may not know is GDP is not even a century old. The idea of gross domestic product was invented just before World War II by an American economist named Simon Kuznets, formulated after that, and then it spread like wildfire around the world. Is that the perfect measure of an economy? Maybe not. We're trying to take that concept one step further in this book. In chapter 2, we give a definition of what is economic power, because our theory is there is no military power without economic power first. And that's a lesson born again and again. Now this image, I wonder if anybody, can I just quickly get a show of hands? Does anybody recognize this image, where it comes from? A few of you do, or one? All right, Paul Kennedy, 26 years ago now, wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. This was the image on the hardback version of the book. It did not last until the publication of the paperback version of the book, and you all can see why. 25 years ago, everyone was worried about the rising power of Japan, how Britain had declined, America was following in those footsteps, and the next world hegemon was, or maybe already had become, the nation of Japan, Japan Inc., that their version of a managed capitalism was better than cowboy capitalism in the West. As I said, within a year, the idea had already been questioned enough that they changed the cover, but now we know it was absolutely untrue. And I'll show you some more images. We want to put some meat on the bones of this idea of power because, not to knock the historians too much, they talk about soft power, smart power, hard power, but they don't measure it. They're very vague concepts. So we can measure those things, and in fact, I'll show you what the real problem with the typical pundit class and how they think about economics is. This is a survey that we did of stories on China's economic growth, or stories on China's economy more properly. We took a random sample of 10 stories from the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The Economist, Washington Post, and then Financial Times, and scanned them to see how often they mentioned the concept economic growth. And you'll see that that's pretty high. Growth was mentioned in about 80% of the stories, 40 out of the 50 stories. But how often did they present any mention of the size of the economy, its GDP, or the fact, we would even count if it was saying China's economy is half the size of the United States, or some relative measure. And then more detailed, the thing that we really care about is how productive is the economy? What's the labor productivity or the total factor productivity, take your pick, or just GDP per capita? That sort of lets you know the technological level of a society. And you can see that was mentioned in 6 of these 50 stories. And these are pretty good publications. So that's the quality of our reporting about China. And to me, there are echoes from 25 years ago when I was a college student, and everyone was warning us about Japan and said, my God, look, they're growing at 10% a year, well, 8% a year, well, 7% a year. We hear the same thing about China. Now, in my house, we have something growing at 10% a year. Her name is Lauren. She just turned 7. And I am worried about her taking over the house when she's 15. But for right now, it's not a threat. That's the way you've got to keep perspective on foreign economies. They can be very small and grow very quickly. And in fact, that's what you hope for. Right? If you're a humanitarian, you want to see the poverty of China be eroded by growth and the spread of capitalism. But the real question is, how is the idea of free market spreading? All right, so measuring the power of the nation. I'm sorry, I ran through this material in my introduction. Political Arithmetic was that great 1676 book by William Petty. So just to flash forward, we're still making advances, and I mean economists. The Penn World Table is an international project that allows us to compare across countries their GDPs in real terms, I mean inflation-adjusted terms, using purchasing power parity, not just exchange rates. So we can actually sense how wealthy the people in China are as a time series and across hundreds of countries. So I'm excited by data. I think this tells us a lot about the world we live in. And it's something that Paul Kennedy didn't understand in his book 25 years ago. He threw out a lot of tables, a lot of figures, but he didn't really have a singular measure of what power is. And I think unless you have that, we really don't know what to fear, right? And we fear the wrong things. We fear the next boogeyman. So here is the picture that's worth a million words. This comes from the Penn World Table, the most recent data. It shows the rise in GDP per capita. As I said, this is really the ultimate measure. The US sets the standard, and it has for as long as we have good data. Other countries approach but never surpass that US level, and Japan's an interesting case study here. Look how poor Japan was in the red line after World War II. Now, the Kennedy thesis is that empires stagnate and fall when they overstretch their empires. Japan was growing and growing, even through a terrific loss in World War II, and kept growing afterwards, after a few years of adjustment. They approached, but they never surpassed, like the pundit said, the level of American prosperity. In fact, they got up to about the 90% level, and then they settled right back down into what is the European standard, about the 80% level of where the US is. Here's a better look at it. Relative to the US level, so assume there's a constant growth rate across the world of 2% at the technology frontier. You can see Japan emerge, surpass the other European powers, the other modern economies, and then fall back. That's because Japan had a model, what we call a supermodel, of development based on copying ideas very successfully. They did manage their trade, which seemed like it was a success. You can do that when you're growing an economy by borrowing. You can't do that if you need to innovate and invent your own technology. You need entrepreneurs. The Japanese are famous, and I say this without criticism. My wife is Japanese. I love the Japanese economy and the people. My friends in Japan acknowledge this very point. They don't have an entrepreneurial economy. They have a big corporate economy with big favors for corporations. They don't have a Silicon Valley. The rare times they have entrepreneurs, like Honda, they succeed despite government resistance in favoring the others. Korea seems to be following the Japanese model, but what's really interesting is you see some of the European economies really starting to fall off even in recent years. So that superior European model is not all it's cracked up to be. And then you see the middling South American countries, and at the bottom, India and Japan. Now, so I'm an economist, right? I get in on an airplane. Well, back in the day before there were cell phones, so now nobody talks. But back in the day when people spoke to one another in public, they would say, hey, you're in an airplane, I'm on an airplane, what do you do? I'd say, well, I'm an economist. And I always thought that was just sort of a normal thing, and I found out that economists are really rare. I thought we were like lawyers, but apparently they're really rare. And so usually you get this reaction. They'll say, you're an economist? What should I invest in? Said, I'm not a business guy. They don't let us deal with real money. Just theoretical money is all I'm allowed to play with. So I don't know. But and then they get angry, like, okay, he's not going to tell me, right? But China and India, people say, Tim, what do you think? Who's going to really grow? Which country is for real? I mean, it's here. This is publicly accessible data. And then you got the purple line and the yellow line. It's pretty clear who's adopted the Japanese growth model with big companies, managed economy, and they'll be successful, probably up until they hit the 50 or 60% level, and then I think they're going to run into some demographic challenges. India's still got a lot of work to do. All right, here are the three supermodels in Europe. It's pretty clear that there's not just one European economy, despite what Paul Krugman tells us. There's a Southern European economy, which is vastly underperforming what should be its potential, right? They've got roughly the same level of human capital. They've got the same currency now for the most part, and yet they have a very different set of institutions. That's really the point of the book, is that institutions create the incentives that let people who are, Glenn and I think people are the same everywhere. We don't really believe in national differences. We can have a talk about culture in Q&A if you want to. I would say culture flows also from institutions. You have a central economy, and you have this Nordic economy, which people say, look, how come people all celebrate capitalism when you've got Sweden and Norway, and look how well they perform, and they're socialist? I would point you to a project that I worked on called the Index of Economic Freedom, or if you don't like that flavor, look at the World Bank's Doing Business Index. That is a nonpartisan product that measures the regulatory burden put on entrepreneurs and businesses. And you know what? Those Nordic economies, they are low regulation, relatively moderate tax states. So they do have big welfare systems, but they have free labor markets. They make it very easy for entrepreneurs to start up. They are free economies. The French and the Southern European economies are not, right? So we know what the institutions are that work. There's no mystery of economic growth. Matt Iglesias, who I consider a friend, wrote a really short 10-sentence blog post about 2 years ago. We mentioned it in the book. And he talked about what a mystery growth is. We really don't know how growth works. I'm like, well, no, that's just really not fair to say. It's like saying we really don't know how the weather works. All right, it's true. I can't tell you exactly what day it's going to snow, but I can tell you it will snow, right, this winter. We've gotten better and better at meteorology, like we've got better and better at fighting cancer. We don't understand all the mysteries, but let's not confuse humility with ignorance. We're humble about what we don't know about growth, but we should be honest about what we do know. And we do know the successful models and what they're good at. And we do know we don't want America to adopt these bad institutions that are hostile to entrepreneurs and that favor big businesses, big labor, big things in general. Okay. So economic power. Here's a quick glimpse at one of the tables in the book. If you don't have one, I think they may have run out of copies. But again, thanks to the Koch Institute, Charles Koch Institute, for providing those to you guys tonight. This table just walks through some calculations of what the power equation is. And we wanted to make this simple. We wanted to make it something that, congressmen wouldn't have to follow calculus, and journalists also would maybe not, cough at it. It's growth squared, I'll tell you why we do that in a second, times GDP per capita. So those three factors we think all matter, combine them together. So you can have two equal economies in size, but one's growing twice as fast as the other. I wouldn't say it's twice as powerful, but it's somewhat more powerful. It's able to push out that technology frontier. It's innovative. And in terms of the military folks in the audience, it's inventing the new technologies of warfare more likely than its a rival. Run through the current numbers in 2010, and you can see the power metrics. If the US sets the standard as the most powerful country, 100%, all of Europe combined is 3/4 as powerful. China's 40%, Japan 15%, South America, at least three leading economies in South America, 7%, India 6%. Those numbers aren't constant, they're changing. In fact, the US power level has decreased in the last 10 years. That's two presidents, one Republican, one Democrat. The growth rate has gone down, and that should concern all of us. So here's another look at economic power over the decades and how it's changed, setting the benchmark level at the US in the year 2000. And nobody's sitting still. This has been an amazing century, and it's likely to continue to be another amazing century that we go into. But that pattern, that trend line we have, that's not because of China and it's not because of Japan. We've fallen off of our A game in the United States. And it's worth examining if our regulatory freedom is the same as it was 10 years ago. Here's a chart that I just think is interesting because people want to talk a lot about Europe. And what's happened in Europe, there is a bit of a crisis. It was especially pronounced while we were writing the book. The concern that if one country fell out of the Eurozone, that the Eurozone itself would collapse. We really questioned that logic, but we also point out that what happened in Europe was a one-time maturity, right? There was this ridiculous assumption in the markets that once they created a common currency, that they had exactly the same risk factor. Now look, if you met my brother Troy, and you could invest in one of us, we use the same currency, but I promise we don't have the same risk factor. And I'm trying not to knock on Troy too bad here, but I would invest in Tim. Point is, it makes sense that currency is just one dimension of risk, right? Each of us has a different credit score, for example, but we probably all use the US dollar. It almost makes me wish, this is why I'm not an investor, I'm just an economist. Why didn't I see this back in 1998 and could have had some investment strategies based on it? But nonetheless, the people that do that stuff, God bless them. They don't have to go through this again. The markets have reappropriated where the risks are, and that's a healthy development. So I'm optimistic on the euro. Now to take one example, in this book we have 8 case studies of great powers in the past and how they went through first economic, but basically political stagnation. One of the most fascinating, I think, is Europe. I love this chapter. Most people think that Europe went from almost like we've taken the Star Wars version of Roman history, that there was this beautiful republic, Darth Vader, Julius Caesar came along and turned it into a dictatorship. That's really not how it happened. There were dictators before Julius Caesar. Sulla was one while he was alive who'd marched on Rome twice. Julius Caesar seized power, was knifed. One of the reasons the senators didn't like Julius Caesar was he expanded the notion of citizenship to include non-Italians. He gave citizenship to other members who were subjects. And the elites in the Senate didn't like that. They thought they could maybe roll back to more traditional values. So here's a guy who's open to immigration, open to trade, very expansive in his outlook, a humanitarian. Kill him. His adopted son Augustus is considered maybe the greatest emperor, rivaling Trajan at best, and had a very small government, allowed a lot of federalism, so cities and regions around Rome were free to set their own laws, their own speed limits, their own minimum wages, not to draw too many parallels to the modern times. But they were still expansive in a lot of ways. And I'm not saying that America should be like Rome and, conquer the world, but that expansive openness to trade and immigration were considered virtues. They lost federalism first. Then in 117 AD, 100 years later, Emperor Hadrian started to build walls and pull back, literally pulled back from the frontiers. Very unpopular decision. He also made the just horrendous, think of the incentives this sets. Hadrian says, look, I'm not really popular because I'm a pacifist. I don't want to fight anymore. I don't want us to be in war. That's not a bad attitude, but we're going to start looking inward. And not only that, I know it's so unpopular, so I'm going to try to buy off the people. Not that this happens nowadays, but there were many people indebted to Rome. There were many cities and states, regions indebted to Rome. So he said, anyone that owes any debt to the Roman government, it's all wiped clean. And nobody believed him. So he had the debt records taken to the Roman Forum and burned. And everybody celebrated for a night. But on day 2 of his Caesarship, they thought, again, what are the incentives? I think I'll take out a loan, right? So they built up a cycle of debt and debt forgiveness. They built up a cycle of rewarding what's called the Praetorian Guard, who were the protectors of the emperor, by giving them big bonuses when the new emperor came to power. Well, eventually the Praetorian Guard caught on. There was a 50-year period called the Crisis of the 3rd Century, where the Praetorian Guard realized whenever they needed a raise or a bonus, they would just knife the emperor. 25 emperors in 50 years, right? So talk about political instability and setting the wrong incentives. Making people pay their debts, making California or Hispania pay its debts. Hispania was a region of Rome, as you'll know. The worst emperor was Severus. Debased the currency because he wanted to spend a lot more than they had. They didn't have debt instruments then, so they would take in all their silver coins, add a little copper, until eventually the amount of silver in a silver coin went from like 80% to 40% under Severus. That's an approximation. And then it went to 40% down to 0 during that crisis of the 3rd century. Just fascinating history about bad fiscal and monetary policy coupled together. Bad institutions, bad incentives. It ends with Diocletian. Now, after this crisis of the 3rd century, a historian looks at Roman history and says, wow, 25 emperors in 50 years, along comes Diocletian, and he brings stability. He's emperor for 20 years. He's the first emperor in centuries to give up power and hand it off peacefully. What a great emperor. Well, the line we have in the book is, Diocletian brought stability to Rome the same way that Stalin brought stability to Russia. It's not the kind of stability you want. He nationalized first the shipping industry. One-time nationalization gets a lot of the benefits and the profits from the grain trade, but starts to lose talented people who don't want to be in shipping because they don't own their shipping anymore. The investors don't want to invest anymore. They lose productivity. Well, then he decides to nationalize the next industry and the next. And he can't control the labor force. There's a glut of labor in the cities. They've come for the free bread and free circuses. And there's a shortage of labor in the countryside where he's established price controls, not working. So he decides in one fell swoop, every man and woman in the current occupation that they have can never change that occupation. Not only that, their children can never do any other occupation. So, I had a dad and a stepdad, so I had a choice. But if that happened to you guys, and you had to do the occupation of your parents, even if it's lucrative, it's probably not what you're doing right now, not what you want to do as free people. You're reacting the same way the Romans reacted. But in a fell swoop, serfdom was created, right? National slavery, central planning. So you go from a gentle loss of federalism, growth of the state, debasement of the currency, bad incentives with debt, to central planning. Now, America's not there yet. I don't know if I'd say we're halfway down this road, but what was scary and what you'll see in the book is the same thing happened in the Ottoman Empire. The same thing happened in Spain. It didn't quite happen in the British Empire. I'm only saying that because Ewan's hosting me. But no, the British Empire is a little bit different. We can talk about it in Q&A. But we're seeing it happen in Europe, bad incentives. We see it happen in Japan, where it reached a stagnation point. So the warning signs are there. All right, totally shifting gears. Let me get your attention before you look up here at the chart. Beneath every economic imbalance is a political imbalance. We talked about a little bit about that in Rome. Especially, we think this is interesting in the China chapter, the centralization of power is dangerous. Here in America, everyone realizes, especially this week, that polarization in our politics has become problematic. And Glenn and I agree with that. We don't think polarization is healthy. In fact, forgive us for being economists, but we see the U.S. political system as a really clear case of monopoly power, monopolistic competition, or a duopoly. Now, what happens in a duopoly if you've got, say, I don't know, Microsoft and Apple? Not only do they want to secure power for themselves, but they do it by making it harder on smaller competition, right? This is why we have government activity trying to stop monopolies, especially stop monopolies that are favored by the state. But our political system's done this. We have a Republican Party and a Democratic Party. They've captured the regulatory apparatus, and they've made it basically with the reforms of the 1970s. When polarization began, we can measure these things with this chart. In the 1970s, they basically made it for a very wealthy person to give $1 million to a candidate. Now, he could give $1 million, but he had to funnel it as soft money through one of the two monopoly parties. And if he wanted to give it to, say, a cause, the green movement, that's not one of the parties. What's the difference between a party and a nonprofit organization, or what the U.S. law calls a nonprofit corporation? I don't think there really is one. But if we look at the evidence, people bemoan polarization and they say what we need is campaign finance reform, not realizing that campaign finance reform is what gave us polarization. So you see the distribution in the extremism of the left and the right parties, right? In 1970, you see it again in the 1990s, and both parties have shifted away from the center. And today, when there's no overlap in the middle. Now, these are relativistic measures. Mann and Ornstein got this just, I think, horrible book called It's Even Worse Than It Looks. They blamed one side, not the other. The facts don't bear this out. They cite this evidence as the bedrock of their argument, but the political scientists who developed this say it's misused by that book, while they don't present any figures and charts. I mean, it's a real misapplication to blame one part or the other and not to look at the institutions, right? People are people. If anything, our people, polls show this, have become less partisan, but our parties have become more extreme, less willing to compromise. This is just like two big companies fighting it out and not wanting entrepreneurial, unorthodox products to take away from their market share. It's not the politicians' fault. It's the rules in place. Citizens United has really changed that. We talk about that in the book. It said that you could donate to corporations, and corporations could be as active as they wanted to in our politics. And everybody thought that meant General Motors and General Electric. Again, the boogeyman's not borne out. It's not the corporations that are for profit that have been active. It's the nonprofit corporations. Now, don't weep for the two parties. The Democratic Party spent $1 billion in the last election cycle. The Republican Party spent $1 billion, like 1.032 versus 1.067. Before, the cycle before, they'd spent, I believe it was $800 billion. So, they're both doing fine. But you saw a trickle of independent expenditures. And now, in this last election cycle, there were $1 billion of independent expenditures. I think that's returning power to the people. I think it's letting more entrepreneurial candidates come in, and I think this experiment will return us back to our First Amendment roots, which were pretty clear: Congress shall make no law. Again, I'm just an economist, so I don't understand words too well, but I think that's what that means. So that's it for the formal presentation. I'm leaving you guys on an optimistic note. I think we will see our politics heal, and Americans will get tired of the fiascos like we've seen this week, where there's no compromise. Thank you. So Ewan, should I just go ahead and field the questions? And I think we have some microphones here. I can't see real well because of the lights, but I'm going to try to take a seat here. And then just raise your hand and I'll try to point to you and we'll get a microphone.
Hi, thank you so much. Tyler ONeill with the Christian Post. Just questioning, do you think that it would be a good idea with the current economic state of affairs to have a candidate like Calvin Coolidge coming in and promising what were his words? A return to normalcy?
You know, I think we will have a great leader again in this country as president. I hope it's sooner rather than later. I also think that someday the American era will have passed. People ask me, is this a declinist book? Are we predicting? Oh, can you not hear me? Okay. Can you all hear me? No? All right, well, I'll come over here anyway. No rest for the kid. Yeah, Calvin Coolidge is a pretty good role model. Amity Shlaes recently wrote a great book, and actually one of my former interns, Charles Johnson's also written a book about Calvin Coolidge. They're both fantastic. And he was Ronald Reagan's favorite president. But I don't know if we can predict what the policy set will be for that great leader. One of the things Glenn and I do in this book is we try to get away from the talk of leaders. And I think we've both been called out on that in these kind of book talks that we've had. I think great leaders really matter, but I think you can see great leaders all the time in this country trying to run for office and losing. And ones that win get frustrated. If the system is geared against compromise and it's geared against original ideas, and it's made in a way where someone who makes good decisions to bring balance to our federal budget, they get voted out of office because they did something bad, whether it's raising taxes or cutting spending. What we find is this equilibrium where both parties talk their talk. No party will actually do what they promise, to cut spending when you get Republicans in power, or to raise taxes when you get Democrats in power. They just don't do it. They do it at the margins. Maybe they'll do a trickle of tax increases on the rich under Obama, and maybe I think Reagan did the most successful job of trying to constrain government spending, but he didn't shrink it. He just held it at bay for a little while. I think you need a rule set change. We propose a balanced budget amendment that's nonpartisan as one solution. But I think you'll probably need a great leader with good ideas about new institutions to push through the political reforms, because the economy will take care of itself if we get good politics back. Great. Other questions? We got here and here.
All right, thank you. I was wondering if you could please expound upon your theory of economic power. So certainly there are countries like Qatar that have a higher per capita GDP than us, but no one would say that Qatar is more economically powerful than the U.S.
That's a great point. Well, I remember hearing about Luxembourg and small states, microstates that can seem rich. And that's why one of the reasons you need a measure like this, that it's not just GDP per capita, it's not just growth rate, and in all fairness, it's not just that the U.S. has the biggest GDP. If that were the measure, we would have looked at Europe at the end of, maybe not the end of World War II, maybe in the 60s and 70s. They had a bigger collective GDP than the United States did, but they weren't growing. And you had demographic factors behind that. So yeah, you can find microstates, but usually they're tied into something bigger. Either you've got the very wealthy people of Europe that are living in a tax haven, which there's nothing wrong with that, but that's what one of those places is. Or you've got a microstate that's selling a product that's very lucrative to the larger world economy, whether it's oil or some other natural resource. And that power disappears when the demand for it disappears, or the trade network is threatened. Right now, the world is benefiting, like the world benefited under Rome, from having essentially a free trade zone that's global now, where the Romans only protected what was in their borders. America's really enforced, I think, with our allies, free trade over the seas, free flights. We've set these great norms. That raises everybody's GDP. Great. And then back here, we have a question.
Is the U.S. heading to a similar situation as in Europe, where we have two different types of America, where states have a different set of fiscal policies as compared to other states, both under the same monetary regime of easy money? And if it's not heading in that same direction, what's preventing us from heading down that same road?
No, there are trends, and I think right now the trends are predominantly toward extracting more from the state. It's a natural instinct in a democracy, even one that has a rich tradition of independence and a pioneering spirit, like the United States has. So that's a concern, and you've got to ask, what are the pressures against that? I think one of the reasons that we see states centralize before they go too far down the bread and circuses path is that it's easy to make those mistakes when you're centralized. When you live in a competitive environment, whether that's the notion that the US was competing against the Soviet Union, that gave us a lot of pressure, and it really made my generation aware of the differences in our system. But when I talk to students today or my children, they don't really think of the Europeans as a rival. They don't think even of the Russians, as much as they like to tweak and agitate our presidents, as ready to launch nuclear missiles. That's kind of the world I grew up in, though. We were very aware of our military power, and that it was based on economic power, and that you had to be sensitive of what are your growth rates, and will the Soviets really surpass us? So I had a very different feel when I was younger. That said, the benefit of having 50 states, these great laboratories of democracy, is if they've got the freedom to have institutional competition, different speed limits, different minimum wages, that's great. It's really an interesting, logical question. Why do we need a federal minimum wage? Even if I love minimum wages, well, I'd like to see California raise it and thrive, and then I could point to the rest of the states and say, see? But we can't do that on the negative. States aren't allowed to lower below this federal minimum. And so I think I see sort of a creeping anti-federalism, where there's one right policy, and we look to the president for everything from natural disaster relief. The battle of our lifetime then will be when one of these states goes belly up, whether that's Illinois, which is in trouble, whether it's California, which is one of the chapters in the book. There will be plenty of voices and energy that we can't let California fall apart, because if its credit falls apart, then what's going to happen to the credit of the other 49 states? That's just baloney. We've maintained independence for all these years, all these centuries, and let's win that fight to let my home states, born in Michigan, grew up in Ohio, not pay for California's errors, and that makes us all healthier in the long run, especially California. But that'll be a fight. I think it's coming in the next few years. I may be wrong. Maybe it's the next decade or two. But we know that's coming. We look at the balance sheets of these states, and they're terrible, a few of them. Way in the back, on the right.
Following up with that, how do you feel about different states and counties that are now talking about succeeding, such as different counties in California? Part of Maryland has talked about succeeding. We know Texas.
Yeah,
These are
I think
serious
Texas.
claims.
I had a friend at the Air Force Academy, Lou DeFelice. If you're out there watching, Lou, you get hazed as a freshman at the academies. I mean, hazed in a nice way, politically correct hazing. But we had to stand at attention and yell, yes, and remember knowledge. Lou had such a horrible voice that they wouldn't let him yell. So he was the only one of us that got to be quiet and didn't get challenged, and so it was hilarious. And then we learned months later that he made his voice horrible. So he had, smart guy, think about incentives. He used to brag, being from Texas, that they were the one state that had it in its, when it joined, it preserved the right to secede from the United States. And I don't know, I think there's a lot of loose talk about that. I think it's not realistic. And really the right approach, if I wasn't making it too obvious before, is America needs to think about being more expansive. I mean, I would really love to see us as a nation bring in a 51st state in Puerto Rico. Now, the people of Puerto Rico are already U.S. citizens. So it's really just a matter of, do we get in the state itself? And I think that would remind Americans of what we really are. We're not a nation. The word nation doesn't even appear in the Constitution. We're a federation. We're a strong federation. We're not a confederation, right? You all know this history. We're losing sight of that and thinking states can't be independent. They can't set up their own health insurance programs, for example. You bring in maybe a different, not just a free trade agreement. What's the next step in how you can integrate with a place that's not even part of your sovereign people? Can you have an alliance agreement with your allies in Latin America and Japan, countries of Europe that are open to that? I'm from Ireland. I'd love to see Ireland be a new special alliance with the U.S. But that sort of creative thinking I don't hear. I hear people in both parties hostile. One party hostile to trade, the other party hostile to immigration. Glenn and I wrote an article you all may have seen in The Atlantic called The Great Wall of Texas. This notion that building a wall that we've never needed for centuries, suddenly need it now, it misunderstands who we are as a people. I've got a bunch of questions, so why don't I take a few questions and I'll try to answer them afterwards. There's one in the middle, like 3 right up here, and I've seen, this gentleman in the very back too. So why don't we go with you first?
Okay. My question is kind of about population and the economy. I know that one of the problems that Japan is facing is that they don't really have a lot of young people to come in and replace the workers. So right. How does the lack of population growth in these economies or in these countries affect the economies and their general ability to stay balanced?
Okay, great question. Let me take another one though too, and I'll try to right here.
Do you think that our inhibitions to political entrepreneurship revolve around our two-party system in the sense that we use a first-past-the-post voting system? And do you think that the parliament-style government that's popular in Europe would help fix that?
Okay. Thank you. That's a great question. And then one more. If you guys can pass the mic up here.
I was just wondering if you could comment a little more on the Northern European economic model of very robust welfare states along with kind of loose, a very entrepreneurial economy, because the left kind of often points to them as a model for us. Okay. So what can we learn, what shouldn't we learn?
Right, okay. Yeah, so first of all on population. There is a demographic challenge facing Japan. It mirrors what faces some of the Southern European economies. The more paternalistic you see your governments being, and the bigger their welfare states, the bigger their social security checks, the more people in those places behave like children. So if you treat your government as your parent, you have to have less and less responsibility, less savings for yourself. You see lower savings rates with countries that have bigger welfare and bigger entitlement programs. And you also see lower birth rates. So Japan, for example, I believe it has a replacement rate would be like 2.1, where every woman of childbearing age has at least 2, a little bit more because, boys are crazy. So you need to have 2.1 kids to replace your current population. In Japan, it's closer to 1. In Italy, maybe it's like 1.2. So that means in a generation, their population will be heading towards half of its size. In 2 generations, a quarter of its current size, right? That is not a recipe for national greatness, but maybe that's not your goal. Maybe your goal is to, enjoy your retirement. So you can't make a value judgment based on that, but you can find these correlations between government institutions and big welfare states, slow growth, and weak population. It is a challenge, but we also have longer lifespans, which a lot of people interpret wrongly as bad news, right? Like, oh my God, all these old people keep living. Of course, Social Security is going to go bankrupt. I think it's only because we've designed our system to punish people for working when they're older. We live in an economy that's already in the future. right? It's not like we're losing manufacturing and heading towards services. The economy right now is 85% service jobs. That is great news. That means you don't need to have muscle labor. You can be 80 years old and have an idea for a company. In fact, I've been an entrepreneur and I've studied entrepreneurship. We tend to think entrepreneurs are named Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and these young prodigies. The odds of you being an entrepreneur in your life are twice as high when you're in your 40s as it is when you're in your 20s. And I would argue that it would be even higher in your 50s and 60s if we didn't have this cultural emphasis based on institutions that 65 is a magic year, you retire then. Why? Okay, let people have some retirement money, but don't take it away from them if they work too much. And some states do that, some nations do that. America has shifted a little bit, but not wholly away from it. And then this notion of first past the post. There is stability in the first past the post type of democracy. I think that's a good thing. I think it brings some good stability to not have 20 different parties. But it doesn't have to be these two parties, right? So because you've got a natural equilibrium in any market, Coke and Pepsi, doesn't mean you should tax excessively other soda makers, right? Or have a bunch of regulatory burdens on those little companies or little movements. So I liken this political discussion to the 1860s. We had a first past the post system that meant there was stability in the Whig and the Democratic parties, but there was an existential threat recognized by this crazy group of radicals called the Republicans. They were all about abolition and ending slavery. The two parties in power were pro-slavery. And so thank God we didn't have the campaign finance laws of today that would have made a third party back then illegal. And eventually it proved one of those was irrelevant to the challenges at hand. Maybe that's happening now, and I think both parties aren't walking the walk, and until they get a real challenge, and it doesn't mean it's from an organized party. Maybe it's from a movement, maybe it's from multiple parties, but we need those fresh energy and ideas. So a first past the post system can still be flexible and dynamic as long as they don't get regulatory capture of the state. Great, 3 more? And then, shut me down, you, and I don't know how long we're supposed to keep going here, but I'll go. I'm having fun. So we had 2 more questions here, and then another one right up front, and I'll keep looking for you in the next round.
That picture on this thing is behind that is a nonlinear differential equation. Mm-hmm. The big problems with differential equations are initial conditions, like the $150 trillion of unfunded liabilities, and boundary conditions like the regulation. How do you get from the ideal situation that you'd like to be to a transition to some kind of situation that'll get us to a next step that it won't make this thing blow up, because differential equations tend to blow up.
Jay, thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
Daniel Rosario from Rutgers University. I just wanted to ask, what role do you see tax credits participating in innovation and continuing the entrepreneurial spirit that has led America to its greatness today?
Tax credits?
Yes. And I mentioned that, I can elaborate a little more on, particularly in the wind energy space and the alternative energy space, as tax credits relate to the economies of those businesses and how we can continue leveraging that financial structure and, again, the economics behind it into other models that can continually help us be a more sustainable country in other areas besides energy.
Okay. And then Philip?
Yeah. Clearly, your focus is when we measure GDP, everything's by nation states, but we live in a world where nation states are not unimportant, but they seem to be less important in having to share power. We see multinational corporations based a lot in America, but in other places, some with revenues greater than national GDPs around the world. We see cultural exports. I was at a meeting in Beijing this year, and I was talking to a young woman who had just come to Beijing to start college from a city 1,000 miles west of Beijing, and I asked, there was some music on, I said, well, who are your favorite musicians? And she said, Katy Perry and Lady Gaga. So you see the culture, and then you see the globalization of telecommunications with the internet, which started in the U.S. but now is a global phenomenon. Does your book look at that all, at any of those phenomena at all, and discuss how that may change the power equation or how this all plays out?
Good questions. I would say that's a great observation about nation states, and I'm fascinated with the literature and the idea that this isn't a permanent feature either of the way things are. We approximate nations of today with empires of the past, but there are huge differences, and I think there's a lot to be said that nations even aren't consistent internally, right? So we're evolving. We're building walled areas that are sort of set off from the rest of society. Sometimes those are ghettos in a negative way. Sometimes they're done to preserve or cut off a culture. And I think that's all fine. What worries me is when you over-define a nation and you build that wall around the nation itself and don't allow that mixing of cultures. Corporations are a new concept, right? The idea of a modern corporation was basically invented in the 1840s, right along the time Karl Marx was writing. So, that's still evolving. The LLC is a new idea. So I don't know where that all goes, and I think it gets a little bit too speculative. So we didn't, to answer your question, handle it, but I think they're important topics. Tax credits, I think I'm biased against tax credits. I think it requires someone to give the credit that assumes they know what the future industry that will be successful is. And I say that as a kid from Michigan whose father had a small business that went bankrupt, that didn't get a bailout, right? We also never got any tax credits because it was a small business. The big three constantly had their business model subsidized. Meanwhile, we were losing car market share to foreign producers. Now, if we hadn't coddled the big three, if we hadn't coddled the labor unions behind the big three, maybe we would have had, to face reality as a state, my state. Maybe we would still, as a nation, own that industry. I think it's a real tragedy that we do tax credits badly, and I don't know if you can do them well. In the 80s, the logic was, look, the Japanese are going after semiconductors. That's the future, and we're losing. Well, it turned out that internet search engines were the future, but nobody knew what those were. Internet search, what? So you can imagine saying that word in 1980, and some guy would have thought there was like this little engine that somehow went out on a net. It's just crazy. And search, it's a search, it goes on a net, it climbs along telephone wires. Anyway, we can't subsidize the future. We can't target the future. We don't know what the future is. And having started companies before, it's really frustrating to see to see governments at the state or the federal level think that they're going to get in the venture capital business. And they do it badly. And it's not, believe me, Republicans do it badly, but Solyndra comes to mind. And I don't think it's the business of government to be picking winners. I think it's okay, I'm not as extreme as some, for governments to help with basic research. But when you're talking about companies that are selling product, that's not the right place to be. The differential equation, it's nonlinear. I don't know if it's differential. We didn't use any calculus. We use the square root of the growth rate. So I still think it's a good equation. But I think, to your point, we see exponential growth rates in debt. That is scary. Look, growth itself is exponential if you're growing at 2 or 3% per year. But if your debt is growing at 5 or 6% per year, then that exponent's not just twice as big. You're going to escalate much faster. So yeah, we need to get ahead of that curve. I don't think we can, though, with two guys writing a book and saying, here's our blue ribbon plan. There have been 100 books like that. We're trying to dig a little deeper into the political problems so that we can then deal with the economic problems. All right, I promised one more question here, and then we'll go after that.
Hi, Faith with Daily Caller. Would you say that the current education system is complicit in promoting Keynesian models of economics that don't work? Because I've met a lot of aspiring economists like yourself that are majoring in economics, and they all favor Keynes over Mises over Hayek. So I was wondering what your thoughts on that were.
I remember my first class, and my teacher laughed, and he goes, "Tim Kane, you better be a Keynesian." Spelled the wrong way. So we need a new type of Keynesianism is what I'd say, or maybe Hubbardism. We talk about Paul Samuelson's book, and for a generation of us, actually for 2 or 3 generations, Paul Samuelson's book, Economics, was the textbook. And the very first graph in the very first chapter introduced people to the concept of GDP. And it showed here's the US GDP growing over time. I think for you guys, the chart would look like this. And here's the Soviet Union's growth rate. It was lower, but it was growing faster. And it was going to surpass the US in about 15 years. Well, the next edition of that book 3 years later, it was, just changed the dates in the lower axis. It was about 15 years. This book went on for, 4 decades, and it was the same graph. It was just 15 years, the Soviet Union's going to surpass us. So, the Keynesians had a lot of, crow to eat. Some people say it's been resuscitated, but I think kids should be exposed to all these different schools. I do think that students today miss what we had, which was that Soviet contrast. But there's no escaping the train wreck that's going to happen in Europe fiscally, in federated Europe, which is another great benefit. And this is the kind of wisdom and insight that we can have because things are real. There's data available. The Romans, the British, the Spanish, the Chinese, they never had the advantages we have, the data that we have. So I'm hopeful. Economists will save the world. Thank you.